Okay, and we'll do other structures of the immune system. So bone marrow, for example, we'll start with. Bone marrow, your bone marrow makes more than 220 billion blood cells in a single day, which I thought was really cool. Two types of bone marrow. There's red bone marrow and yellow, and they each produce different types of blood cell. So red bone marrow contains blood-forming stem cells, and yellow bone marrow contains stem cells that produce fat, cartilage, bone, all that sort of connective tissue. So we do have stem cells in our bone. In our bone marrow, they divide, they become progenitor cells, and then those progenitor cells will divide and further differentiate into the immune cells. Depending on what immune cells they become, they could further differentiate even more. So like if they become monocytes, then obviously they're going to become macrophages or dendritic cells at some point. So all blood cells, red and white, come from the progenitor cells, and the progenitor cells come from bone marrow stem cells. And B cells remain in the bone marrow to mature, but T cells head to the thymus. And these bone marrow stem cells are, again, another hot topic with like immunotherapy regarding cancer. They'll do like bone marrow transplants, if they can find sort of the focus of where the cancer is coming from, then they can actually try to transplant the bone marrow. And that is an area that they're looking into right now, which is cool. And B cells remain in the bone marrow to mature, but T cells, like we said before, head to the thymus to mature. And over here, we have some red blood cells. Over to the right, the platelets are also made. We're not really going to talk about them too much in this lecture, but those are just the clotting proteins that are also made in your bone marrow. And white blood cells, obviously, are also made in your bone marrow. Your appendix and your tonsils. I don't know why I put intestine there. I have to fix that. Both can be removed safely in humans without much consequences. I'm sure you all know someone who has had either one of them or even both of them removed. You can lead a perfectly healthy life without either of them, which led people to believe for a very long time that these were vestigial structures, when in fact they're not. Tonsils obviously have an immune responsibility, and the appendix, even more recently, was known to have an immune responsibility. So the tonsils are two masses of lymphatic tissue that sit at the back of the throat. They catch pathogens that enter the mouth and keep throat and lung infections away. So specifically when we inhale and when we breathe in, your tonsils basically act as a net. They can catch anything that's coming in, and they can notify lymph nodes and other spots in your immune system to mount a response. So if things are going into your mouth, the first piece of lymphatic tissue that they're going to hit, the first piece of immune tissue that they're going to hit are those tonsils. So they are decently important, but I mean, our body has a lot to its immune system. So when the tonsils are removed, we can still mount a pretty good immune response to pathogens that come in through our mouth, just because there are so many other avenues that it can go down. And the appendix was thought to have no function until recently. Like I said, even when I was in high school, we were taught that the appendix was a vestigial structure, that it was left over from thousands of years ago. But it does serve some functions. It's not super, super important, but it is made of lymphatic tissue, very similar to the tonsil. It does serve some sort of immune function. It basically just monitors the bacteria between your large and small intestine. So it's attached to the cecum, which is where your large and small intestines are connected. And it's basically just a breeding ground for bacteria. So it'll help the good bacteria grow. It'll help like your gut bacteria grow, but it can also detect when there are pathogens in there as well. So it does serve some small immune function, which is decent to mention. I don't think that'll pop up on the MCAT, but it's decent to mention. Okay, so we have the spleen, which is located in the left upper region of your abdomen. As you can see in this picture right over here, it's this little like 4 to 5 inch structure over there. It houses macrophages that help filter the blood and destroy old unfit red blood cells. So it's kind of like a maze. Your blood goes through the spleen, and there are little macrophages all along the path. And if it detects any old, any misshapen, any sort of like blood cell that's not fit, it's going to break them down and it's going to recycle them. So it recycles the iron from the old blood cells and it sends it back to the bone marrow for hemoglobin production. Because any sort of mineral or any sort of metal that's in your body tries to do a good job at preserving it because they're hard to come across, especially, evolutionarily speaking, in the ancestral environment, they're pretty hard to come across. So your body has come up with some pretty cool tricks to conserve resources. And this is one of them. They recycle iron, your spleen, and it helps it create new red blood cells. So the spleen will also, instead of just filtering out old blood cells, it's also going to filter the blood for foreign microorganisms. So if they're detected, the spleen and local lymph nodes will increase lymphocyte production to combat the infection. So your lymph nodes work on a local system as well. Wherever your infection is in your body, you will be able to tell where it is based on which lymph nodes are swollen. So you may have noticed this before, you may not have, but for example, if you have like a cut or some sort of infection in the right side of your mouth, you're going to notice that the lymph nodes on the right side of your face are more swollen than the ones on the left side of your face, because proximity does affect lymph node function. And it's the same thing with the spleen. We have a lot of lymph nodes in our body. So the ones that are near the spleen, when they are detected, when microorganisms are detected, the lymph nodes are going to increase that T and B cell production, and they will combat the infection. And then we have the thymus, which is a pretty cool organ. It's located in the sternum between the lungs, and it puzzled scientists for a very long time because they would always look at the thymus in adults. And by the time you're an adult, your thymus is not very prominent. By the time you're like completely old, it's basically just a heap of fatty tissue that does absolutely nothing. It's really only active from childhood to like your teenage years, because that's when your T cells are maturing. Once you reach adulthood, you basically have all of your T cells that are matured circulating your body. And the thymus plays a huge part in preventing autoimmunity, which are self-damaging immune cells, which we'll talk about in a little bit. T cell maturation occurs in the thymus during childhood until about the teenage years. So like I said before, a 75-year-old's thymus would most likely be nothing more than fatty tissue. And that was why it was so elusive to scientists that were trying to study it for so long, because they didn't really know that it was part of the immune system. They didn't know what the function was. So they were only looking at adults, so they weren't really thinking to look at children. T cells undergo positive and negative selection in the thymus. So this is basically, the thymus is basically T cell boot camp. Positive selection means only immature T cells that can bind to MHC proteins will survive to maturity. So they have to be able to recognize those MHC proteins. If they don't, they're going to be useless, because that's what T cells do. They recognize these MHC proteins and they mount an immune response. So if they can't even recognize a foreign antigen, they're no good. So they would be destroyed in the thymus before they were released to circulation. They also undergo negative selection in the thymus. So negative selection means only T cells that don't bind to self-antigens presented in the thymus will reach maturity. So the thymus is really cool in that it has these specialized cells in it that they display protein sequences that are found throughout your entire body. So you will find these different antigens in the thymus. You'll find like protein sequences that could be found in your eye, or protein sequences that will be found in your foot. And you can find them in the thymus because it's specifically where these T cells are made. So negative selection means if I put proteins that are found in the human eye, if I have a T cell in here that reacts with this and mounts an immune response, we're going to get rid of that immediately, because that's an autoimmune response, and we don't want that. We don't want any cells that recognize ours, and we do want cells that recognize foreign. So T cells undergo positive and negative selection in the thymus, and it's super important that they do. Specifically, in my opinion, the negative selection, because autoimmunity is very dangerous. And I think that's a really cool process. And all of this is pretty much done by the time you reach your 20s. And then your thymus is pretty much inactive. Does anybody have any questions about that? I feel like they like to mention the thymus a lot on the MCAT I've seen. They never get too into detail, but they definitely do mention it a lot when immunity is mentioned. So definitely know those different organs that we just went over. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to answer this question. So half of you said A, half of you said I have no idea. And the answer is A. Cool. So let's take a look. A child undergoes emergency surgery and must have his thymus removed. Which of the following could be a potential outcome of this procedure? So B says the child will not experience any issues because the thymus is inactive, which is not true. We just spoke about how the thymus is active in children up until like their teens, maybe their early 20s. After that, the thymus becomes inactive, but a child undergoing surgery would still have an active thymus. The child will have reduced immunity because of interrupted B cell maturation. That's not true. B cells don't mature in the thymus. B cells mature in the bone marrow. The child will experience an increase in adaptive immunity. Probably not. Just because the child will have reduced immunity because of interrupted T cell maturation. That's really what is going to happen, because T cells are still under the process of maturing, and we're still selecting which specific T cells we want to let out into circulation. So if you remove a thymus while that's happening, we're not gonna have mature T cells, and the child would either be they would be immunocompromised, or they would have like some sort of autoimmune condition. But they definitely wouldn't experience an increase in like healthy working adaptive immunity. It would definitely be not good. So the child will have reduced immunity is the most likely outcome of that situation. That's just because we're removing the thymus before it has a chance to do what it needs to do.